New Explorer Corps, First Arm, Spinward Operations Area, 7 jumps from Land's End. January 30th, 3152. "You're tapping again," Captain Rin Barrett said with frustration as she leaned against the armrest of the command chair. Her normally tightly braided curly auburn hair was a bit out of sorts as it escaped her white officer's cap. Cal Levitt, her second in command, immediately stopped tapping his fingers on the holotable and apologized. He looked tired, and Rin was sure she looked worse. Now 7 jumps away from Land's End, where they were able to resupply and turn over their discovered data. "When will we have the updated jump coordinates to factor in the new star set?" Rin asked as she turned to the navigator. The woman in her mid-20s was busy looking at several screens and pulling information from both before concentrating on a third. After a several-second pause, she said, "We should have new coordinates in just a few minutes. Looks like our best jump is to this main sequence white dwarf designated J4884B2 on the table." Both Rin and Levitt looked over at the holotable as the navigator pulled the star up for a close-up view. She continued, "From the wobble and light occlusion, it looks like there are at least a couple of planets in the system." "What's our second best jump?" Rin asked, with only slightly masked frustration. She knew her tone was off because Levitt looked over at her and shook his head. "He's right. It's not her fault that the past 3 jumps have been duds. Only one of the stars had a rocky planet, and it was baked to a crisp by a red giant star it was orbiting." She sighed, sat up a bit in the chair, and said, "All right, we jump in 15. Let's make a show of this one and shake the dust off. I want the Holtz and their fighters and prepped. Olivia and Akeef, you're in the hot seats." Levitt smiled and said, "Yes, ma'am," before turning and passing along the orders over the rabbit's foot comms. Rin might be feeling tired, but they were sure to find something soon. 15 minutes later, the rabbit's foot jumped 28.2 light-years further away from the rest of humanity. New Explorer Corps, First Arm, Spinward Operations Area, 8 jumps from Land's End. February 5th, 3152. The blue-green planet was a tantalizing prospect even before the radio signals were picked up. It was clearly just background noise and not a deliberate attempt at contacting the jump ship as it sat on the host star's zenith jump point. Rin listened closely to the voices, which had a strange cadence and some of the words were familiar yet pronounced oddly. After several hours of listening in what sounded like weather reports and local civics discussions, Rin began to prep her orders for a trip down to the surface. Because this planet had inhabitants, she wanted to make sure that they would be well prepared for any eventuality. That included 3 out of the 4 battlemechs with their Mechwarriors and Vasil, just in case they needed someone who could navigate clan social structure. With the Akrai as the new backup dropship following its repairs, the Mule-class dropship Alelia undocked and started its burn toward the planet. 76 hours later, the dropship was setting up a course to land just outside what looked like the planet's largest settlement. That seemed to be the best word for it rather than city or even town, as the imagery taken by the Alelia's drones showed cobbled-together structures mixed with what looked like a considerable amount of wreckage. The remnants of the scar across the plain suggested that a large ship had crashed there at some point in the distant past. The settlement rose among what was left. At least, that was the science team's best guess as they sifted through the photos and video. The team was ready on touchdown. Just seconds after the dropship settled on its landing struts, the loading ramps opened. Tenika's intimidating Zeus led the way, stopping a few dozen yards to stand guard as May's Commando and Olivia's Thunderbolt stomped down the ramps. As the 3 mechs set up a semicircle around the dropship, Rin walked down the ramp with Vasil in his battle armor a few meters away along with the science team. It would have been quite the scene for anyone who watched, though no one seemed to have come to see the show. Rin tasted some wind-blown dust in her mouth as she felt the warmth of a star on her face for the first time in months. The planet was a relatively comfortable temperature, though a little drier than Rin would have preferred. Everything had a fine layer of dust on it, likely from the shifting global winds that carried it from the planet's equatorial deserts. She looked off past the mechs toward the settlement, somewhat disappointed that no one seemed eager to greet them. "Tenika and Vasil, you're with me. Let's go meet the neighbors," Rin said, telling the science team to begin their work under the safety of the dropship ramps and the guns of the Commando and Thunderbolt. Crates were unpacked, computers set up, and science drones prepped as the trio of human, elemental, and battlemech walked toward the settlement. It was obvious from that ground-level viewpoint that the ship that had crashed there long ago was massive. "Do you think it was a warship?" Rin asked into the comlink on her collar. "At least a heavy cruiser. However, there look to be multiple ships here. Look at the paint. Vasil said as he started to lead Rin a bit on the approach to reduce the possible angles of incoming fire on the captain. Tenika stepped very slowly with her Zeus to prevent outpacing Rin, only taking a step every 5 or 6 seconds. Sure enough, Rin could see the worn remnants of multiple paint schemes on the wreckage. Back at the dropship, Olivia watched the trio walk into the settlement. The Zeus looked almost comical, trying to step its way through what passed as a through street. After several seconds of wanting to laugh about it into the comm, Olivia pulled her gaze back to the horizon, scanning for any possible threats. Her mind wandered again to the HBG planet and the hard drives that the captain had promised to destroy. Olivia had tried to talk to the captain about it several times, only to be shut down pretty hard when Rin said the matter had been dealt with. She wanted to believe the captain, but a nagging doubt persisted. May broke comm silence while slowly walking her commando around the dropship. "This wouldn't be a half-bad place to set up shop so long as you're into rusted metal and sand," she said with her usual soft and even tone. Olivia smirked, but didn't give May the satisfaction of a laugh. Instead, she responded, "I had no idea you were such a romantic. Why don't you bring that commando over here and propose on one knee?" May chuckled. "You're out of my league, Mechwarrior. Plus, you're pretty high maintenance in that Thunderbolt." "The better to stomp on you with, my dear," Olivia said as she scanned the bits of rock and scattered ship wreckage. Vasil carefully looked into some of the smaller structures that lined the packed dirt street, but came up with nothing but abandoned debris covered in dust. Rin sighed, frustrated that this opportunity was turning out to be a waste of time. She had read stories from the Comstar days, with the Explorer Corps discovering a long-lost human colony and bringing them back into the fold. Rin felt a little embarrassed by how badly she wanted that to be the case with this settlement. She was begrudgingly getting closer to admitting the bloom was coming off of this rose. "Captain, the radio signal is coming from up ahead," Vasil said as he began to move up ahead toward the rusted steel structure. Rin dropped her hand down to her holster and unsnapped it, just in case, as the elemental kneeled down to peek inside the structure through a wide doorway. Vasil swept the room with the small laser that made up his battle armor's left arm, but all he saw inside were some tables, scattered chairs, and a radio set hooked up to a computer on a table resting on the back wall. Vasil kept a lookout at the doorway while Ren walked in, laser pistol in hand. Tenika scanned in her Zeus, looking up and down the street as the captain disappeared through the doorway. Reaching the radio, Rin looked down at it and noted that it was the only thing she had seen so far which didn't have a fine layer of dust on it from its keyboard and deck. When she reached down and hit the spacebar, the computer screen flickered to life. On it was written 2 words in green digital text. Rin only had a moment to process the words, "Got ya," before she heard explosions in the distance and the rattling of autocannon fire. "It's an ambush!" Rin yelled as she turned back to head out toward the door. Seeing Vasil leveling his small laser down the street and firing, the hair on Rin's arms stood up as the small laser ionized the air. A grenade landed at Vasil's armored feet, but he kicked it as soon as it had arrived. The explosion caused no damage, but Rin was knocked back, her ears ringing so hard her head throbbed. She looked around on the ground for her laser pistol as it had slipped from her hands moments before. Vasil's voice broke through the ringing, sternly but calmly saying, "Stay here. We will handle this." The Zeus stepped backward to get some space on the concealed firing positions that were pouring fire into Tenika's mech. Dozens of different weapons were all firing at her at the same time, and while Tenika was starting to return that fire, her shots paled in comparison to the damage her mech was receiving. None of the weapons were causing much damage on their own, but the cumulative effect was driving the Zeus back and eventually down to one knee. Armor melted, chipped, and blasted off the mech even as she fired her medium pulse lasers into the wreckage around her. Lining up a shot where she saw tracers of autocannon fire, she squeezed the trigger on her stick, and the Zeus thudded with the generation of an artificial lightning bolt. It crackled through the air and slammed into the already twisted steel. Solids became boiling liquids, and the firing from that gun ceased. Tenika grimaced as her cherished mech started to fight her more and more. Forced down to one knee when the left leg actuator buckled, she cursed and hit the shutdown override. She saw Vasil running and firing at various targets as he tried to reach the Zeus, but she screamed into the comlink, "Get to the captain! Get her out of here while they're focusing on me!" The elemental hesitated, stopping and looking back at the Zeus for a few seconds before turning and heading back to the captain. Over the link, she heard his voice say, "Stay alive, friend. Today is not your last day." And it filled her with courage. Their friendship had grown strong in the time since they had met on the station, and she knew that today wasn't going to be the day. She lifted the mech's arm and fired the PPC again. The azure lightning slammed and then melted into the side of a firing position, and then completely through it. Vasil was furious at himself for letting his comrades fall into this ambush. It was his job to keep the captain safe, and he had clearly failed. As he reached the doorway where Rin was cowering, he reached out with his clawed hand. She looked up at him. Her tired and scared face now looked slightly confused until he said over the comm, "We have to go. I can carry you. Tenika is buying us time." Rin looked up at the elemental's view screen and nodded, standing up and then letting him pick her up with his right arm. The next few moments were a blur as Vasil began to run as quickly as he could down the street, firing the small laser at targets of opportunity along the way. Dirt and dust was kicked up around the fleeing pair as the small arms fire chased them and pelted the back of the battle armor. Rin leaned back and looked for Tenika's mech, wanting to scream as the machine slowly crumbled to the ground. Every inch of the mech's armor was pockmarked, melted, or missing entirely, and the Zeus had no choice but to join the rest of the wreckage around it. Vasil tried to focus on what was ahead rather than the pain he wanted to feel for Tenika. She would be okay. She was too stubborn to die. At least that's what he told himself as he broke from the cover of the buildings and raced towards the dropship. When Rin turned her head back to look, she saw that Olivia and May were locked into a fight of their own around the dropship. Light vehicles were circling the ship, taking shots at the mechs and the ship like 24 mosquitoes. They were incredibly hard to hit, though the few turrets on the Eulalia were doing their best to provide covering fire, while the science team scrambled back into the dropship. Rin heard May's voice spewing a chain of curse words in Chinese over the short-range comms, and it would have been humorous if their entire mission wasn't in jeopardy. Olivia was standing her ground at the base of one of the ramps, taking aimed shots trying to lead the light vehicles. She was occasionally scoring hits and rendering those vehicles into scrap, but with so many it felt helpless. May's commando fired its weapons and then began to run at the vehicles. Her fury was apparent as she managed to catch one with a kick, which sent the truck and its occupants spinning a dozen times before smashing back into the hard-packed earth. Vasil managed to run through the fray and up the ramp before setting the captain down. She quickly retreated further inside and he was off, triggering his jump jets and leaping up into the air. Olivia followed May's lead and began to push out from the dropship, forcing the vehicles to either increase the size of their circle or risk being kicked and crushed. Some of them chose option A and some went with option B. Huge clouds of dust were being kicked up into the air as the air cracked with laser fire and autocannon rounds. SRMs from May's mech spiraled into one of the slower-moving heavy technicals, and it blew apart so catastrophically that there was just scattered burning pieces remaining. A vehicle swerved close, rolling to a stop near the Thunderbolt's leg, and several soldiers hopped out carrying satchels. One climbed up onto the mech's left leg, which triggered the sensors and warned Olivia what was happening. She sidestepped the Thunderbolt quickly, catching the climber off guard. He dropped the satchel, which fell to the ground and exploded at his partner's feet. The Thunderbolt showed a considerable chunk of damage on the foot from that close call, but it was better than having a blown-out knee actuator. The climber hung on as the Thunderbolt broke into a jog, trying to shake him off. He would have been successful if a metallic claw hadn't wrapped around his ankle. With a firm tug, he was forced to let go, and Vasil triggered his jump jets, sending both him and the soldier he was carrying up into the air. At the apex of his jump, Vasil let go and let gravity do its job as he aimed to land near another circling vehicle. Seeing the flailing man fall over 80 meters and slam into the ground made Olivia smirk. She pulled up the comms as she lined up another shot, saying, "I didn't know you clanners had style." She received a reply even as she watched the elemental fire its small laser into the engine block of a truck that instantly caught fire. Vasil said, "We are all in a battle with gravity, some more than others." Seeing the battle shifting, the remaining dozen vehicles began to peel off and head toward the safety of the settlement's wreckage. The mechs gave chase and fired into their retreat until Captain Rin's voice came over the comm and told them to hold back, that the settlement itself was a mech-killing trap. "Where's Tenika?" May yelled into the comm link. "She held the line so that we could get the captain out," Vasil replied, barely containing his fury as his adrenaline flowed. "We have to go get her," May replied. "I will," Vasil said. He wanted to break orders that moment and head into the settlement, but decades of conditioning made that impossible, so he ran back into the dropship instead. "Everyone get onto the ship. We're going to relocate. We aren't leaving until we get Tenika back." Rin spoke into the comm link, trying to sound like a captain should sound like in that moment, even though she was shaking. The mech stomped their way back onto the dropship, and 5 minutes later it was in the air, riding on plumes of plasma. 3 kilometers away from the settlement, it settled back down on a small plateau. Rin sighed as she walked into the cargo bay where Vasil was still standing in his battle armor, looking as ready for a fight as he was before. Instead of tackling that wall, Rin turned towards Olivia and May, who both look extremely pissed off. "We will get her back," Rin said, seeking to placate their anger, then adding, "We need a plan." In the darkness of the cockpit, Tenika stewed silently. The last thing she saw before closing her neurohelmet off and the power systems dying was an endless sea of red warning flashes, error reports, and override warnings. The cockpit was filled with black smoke, and she could smell the hint of burning plastic and wiring even though her helmet was sealed, and she was using her emergency air supply. The straps of her harness dug into her shoulders, and her head wanted to fall, so she must have been sitting at an angle. Ejection was an option, but Tenika dismissed that. Losing her battle mech was one of the most traumatic experiences a Mechwarrior could live through, and was compounded by the fact that her loss wasn't in a straight-up fight with another mech, but ambushed by cowards. Looking forward, all Tenika could see was the dirt and scattered metal debris that was everywhere in the settlement. No ejection. They'd have to dig her out of the mech with crowbars and torches. Until then, she would sit and wait. Maybe, if they took long enough, Vasil and the others could rip them apart. Tenika smiled at the prospect of her favorite clanner tearing these thugs into pieces. Maybe she can live long enough to see it. They would come for her, or at least, they would make these thugs regret their ambush. She took a deep breath, found her calm, and waited as she started to hear the sounds of boots on the armor of the Zeus's head. End Part 7. Thanks as always for watching. I hope you're enjoying the series so far. If you are, hitting the like and subscribe buttons can help keep the whole venture running. If you want to go one step further, there's a Ko-Fi link in the video comments below where you can support the channel directly. With that, you get access to the Discord channel, you can play Mechwarrior 5, and share input on where you like the story to take our characters next. New Explorer Core videos are going to fall on Mondays from now on, with other projects in between. I hope to see you again next time. With that, have a great day, and go make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.